My daughter-in-law, Irene, had cancer, and the treatment cost more than $30,000. My son, Chris, sold everything: the house, the car, even their wedding rings. She survived, but shortly after she said, "I don't want to live with a poor man," and she filed for divorce. She took half of the little he had left and got full custody of the children. My son, shattered, moved back in with me. That night, an unknown man knocked on the door. "I want to speak with your son." I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are listening to my story of revenge from. I want to know how far it has reached. I was in the small kitchen, my hands still covered in flour from the last batch of sourdough I was preparing for the store the next morning. The wall clock read 9 o'clock at night, its tick-tock mixed with the soft aroma of flour and yeast. The house was quiet. I could only hear my own murmuring, counting the loaves left to bake. Then the phone rang, a cold ring that sliced through the air. I jumped, dropping the flour on the floor. Who would call at this hour? My children rarely called so late, unless something serious had happened. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked quickly toward the old phone on the wooden shelf. My son, Chris's, name appeared on the screen. I answered, my voice a little shaky. "Hello, Chris?" On the other end, there was only heavy breathing, as if he was trying to hold something back. "Mum." Chris's voice sounded hoarse, lost, like someone trapped in the middle of a storm. I had never heard him like that, not even when his father died. My heart tightened, but I tried to stay calm. "What's wrong, honey? Tell me, I'm listening." He was silent for a long time, so long I thought he had hung up. Then he said a phrase, every word strangled. "Irene. She wants a divorce." I stood motionless, gripping the receiver. A divorce? Irene, my daughter-in-law. The woman Chris loved more than his life, for whom he gave up everything to save her. No, it couldn't be. I shook my head, trying to push the idea away. "What did you say? Divorce? Why? What happened? Why so suddenly?" Chris told me, in a choppy, desperate voice. Irene had filed for divorce and was asking for custody of the 2 children, Leo and Sophia, my little angels. Not only that, she also wanted to divide the house. I asked him the reason again and again, but Chris only repeated, "I don't know, Mum. She didn't say anything, just that she doesn't feel anything anymore." She doesn't feel anything anymore? How was that possible? I remembered the nights Chris held the sick Irene, the sleepless prayers he made, begging for her life. How could anyone forget all that? I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down to reassure him. "Relax, honey. All couples have rough patches. Maybe Irene is just upset. You did everything for her. You gave up everything. She can't treat you like this." I told him to take care, to try to talk to his wife, and hung up. But as I set the receiver down, my hands were trembling. I felt a weight on my chest, as if a massive stone was crushing my heart. The following days, I called him several times. Sometimes he didn't answer. Other times he replied in a dull, exhausted voice. He told me Irene had hired a lawyer, that she was distant, like a stranger, and wouldn't let him near the children. 3 weeks after that first call, it started raining heavily. I was sitting at the table, holding a cup of cold coffee, when I heard a soft knock on the door. I got up and pulled back the window curtain. Under the yellow porch light, I saw Chris standing there, soaked, his face haggard and his beard neglected. Beside him, an old travel suitcase with broken edges. My heart stopped. I yanked the door open and pulled him inside without asking anything. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes, and suddenly he collapsed, crying like a child. "Mom, I lost everything. She took the children and the house. She wants to sell it to split the money." I held my son tightly, feeling his back trembling under my hand. My Chris, the strong man who once carried the whole family, was now fragile as a dry branch in the storm. His suitcase burst open, and some belongings rolled across the floor. A wrinkled t-shirt, some old shoes, and a small photo of Leo and Sophia. I looked at the photo, saw the radiant smiles of my grandchildren, and tears welled up in my own eyes. I helped Chris in, dried him off like when he was a boy. I made him a hot cup of ginger tea and forced him to drink it sip by sip. He sat motionless in the chair, his gaze lost on the wall. I didn't know what to say to him. I just placed my hand gently on his shoulder and murmured, "Stay here with me, as long as you need, honey." But deep down, I knew those words couldn't ease his pain. That night, when Chris fell asleep on the couch, I sat silently by the dining table, unable to close my eyes. The house was calm, only the sound of rain hitting the sheet metal roof and my son's heavy breathing. I looked at him, his messy hair covering a face that was once full of life. I remembered the days when he and Irene had just married, how he held her hand, the sparkle in their eyes when they talked about the future. I had believed Irene was the gift God had given my son, but now she was the one who had dealt him the most painful blow of his life. Suddenly, firm knocks on the door jolted me out of my thoughts. I started, my heart pounding. Who would come at this hour in the middle of the rain? I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. An unknown man was there, thin, looking tired, with sunken eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. I cracked the door open, speaking cautiously. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man hesitated a moment, his voice hoarse, not daring to look at me directly. "I need to talk to Mr. Chris Johnson." I was about to close the door and tell him my son was sick, but he raised his hand quickly, desperately. "Please, ma'am, I'm Philip. I know your son's wife, Ms. Irene Torres. I've come to tell you the truth." The truth? Those two words pierced my chest like a knife. I looked at him, trying to decipher something in his tired eyes. There was something in his voice, a mixture of desperation and sincerity, that stopped me from turning him away. My mind filled with confusing thoughts that, without realizing it, took me back to where everything began. I still clearly remember that Saturday night, more than a year ago, when the whole family gathered around the big table in my house in Chicago. The smell of freshly made mac and cheese filled the air, that dish that Chris and my grandchildren loved the most. Leo and Sophia, my two little treasures, were fighting over the last piece of cornbread, laughing loudly. Chris, sitting at the head of the table, was telling a funny story about a customer at the auto shop who swore his car was haunted because the headlights blinked on their own. We all laughed. Even Irene smiled sweetly, serving more roast beef onto her husband's plate and wiping Sophia's mouth with a napkin. Seeing her, I thought my son was lucky. Irene was beautiful, kind, attentive, an angel sent by God to care for him. But then, just as the atmosphere was warmest, Irene placed her chopsticks on the plate. The small sound of them hitting the porcelain made me shiver. Her smile suddenly disappeared, like a light abruptly turned off. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned toward her. I saw her hands trembling, her eyes full of tears, but she didn't speak immediately. Slowly, she opened her purse and took out a sheet of paper folded in four, placing it on the table as if it weighed a ton. I looked at it, and a dark premonition ran through my body. Chris, sitting next to her, frowned and reached out to take it. He opened it, and I saw my son's face turn as pale as the paper. His hands were shaking, his eyes fixed on those written lines. "Irene, what is it?" I asked, my voice broken with worry. She took a deep breath, as if she needed to gather all her courage to speak. Then, between sobs, she said in a trembling voice, each word cutting the air like a knife, "The doctor, he said I have uterine cancer, stage 3. The whole room fell silent. Leo and Sophia's laughter died down. I felt like I couldn't breathe, as if all the oxygen in the room had disappeared. Chris was the first to react. He crumpled the paper in his hands and ran to hug his wife, his voice trembling. "It can't be. I don't believe it. No, Irene, it can't be." He repeated it over and over, as if saying it would be enough to make the reality disappear. Irene sank into his arms, crying inconsolably, her fragile shoulders shaking uncontrollably. I, stunned, reached out to take the wrinkled paper from Chris's hands. The printed letters, cold and clear, along with the red seal of a major hospital in New York, left no room for doubt. Uterine cancer, stage IMUIB, accompanied by the signature of Dr. Edward Sanders. I read it again and again, as if I could find an error, a flaw in the printing, something that proved it was a misunderstanding. But that red seal, sharp and cruel, seemed to stab a thorn into my heart. A mother's instinct woke up in me. I coughed softly, trying to stay calm. "Irene, Chris, listen to me. I have an old friend, Dr. Morrison. He's one of the best oncologists in the city. We should go see him." But Irene strongly refused, hiding further in Chris's chest. "No, Mum." Her voice was weak, full of fear. "I'm too scared. The doctor in New York already made the treatment plan. I don't want to start over. I don't want to see anyone else." Her words were a plea that completely disarmed me. Chris, still in a panic, rejected my suggestion. "Mum, please don't scare her more. We'll follow this doctor's treatment. I'll do anything, Irene, I swear. I'll sell everything. I'll take you to the best hospital if necessary." He took her hand, his eyes filled with determination, although I also saw desperation in them. Dinner ended in tears and a heavy silence. Leo and Sophia, though small, felt the change in the atmosphere. They no longer fought over the cornbread. They stayed still, their eyes wide, looking at their parents. I tried to smile, to keep things normal, serving them more food. "Eat, my darlings. Grandma will tell you the story of the fox and the heron." But my voice trembled, and the story never continued. As I cleared the table, I noticed Irene's soup bowl was still untouched, cold. She was there, staring into nothing. I wanted to go closer, ask her if she was in pain, if she needed anything, but something in her gaze stopped me. Maybe I was just overreacting, I told myself. She's sick. She needs time. That night, when my son and his family returned to their home, I stayed awake in my old bed. The image of the diagnosis kept repeating in my mind, along with Irene's broken voice. I thought of Chris, of how he would do the impossible to save her. I thought of Leo and Sophia, those innocent little ones who didn't deserve to suffer. And I thought of myself, an elderly mother who only wanted to see her children and grandchildren happy. Finally, I made a decision. I would temporarily move in with Chris and his family. I would tell them it was to look after the children and help around the house, but in reality, I wanted to be close to Irene, to make sure she received the best possible care. I couldn't leave my son's family alone in the middle of this storm. The day I arrived with my suitcase, Chris and Irene's house no longer had the warmth it once did. The wooden door was the same, but the children's laughter was gone from the yard. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with sadness and worry. Leo and Sophia were playing in a corner, but quieter than usual, as if they didn't want to bother anyone. Irene was lying on the couch, covered with a thin blanket, her face pale. Chris, meanwhile, was reviewing some papers with an anxious expression. I walked in, put my suitcase on the floor, and smiled as best as I could. "I'm here. From today on, I'm going to help you, Irene. Rest. Let me take care of everything." Irene looked up and gave a weak smile. "Thank you, Mum. I'm very lucky to have you." Her words warmed my heart. The first week after the diagnosis, Chris decided to sell the delivery truck from the auto shop. It was an old vehicle, with an engine that roared every time he started it, but it was his main work tool. I remember the afternoons Chris and his father, my husband, sat cleaning it together, laughing while talking about long delivery trips. The day Chris put it up for sale, I saw him standing in the yard, a rag in his hand, slowly wiping the worn paint. His eyes were full of nostalgia, as if saying goodbye to a part of his youth. The buyer arrived, a middle-aged man with a rough voice, who offered a price so low I wanted to scream that it was a rip-off. But Chris just nodded, signed with a shaky hand, and said quietly, "Thank you." Then he handed all the money to Irene. Less than a month later, Chris put the auto shop up for sale, the legacy his father had left him. That place was not only his livelihood, but also the shared memory between father and son. I remember when Chris was a child, running after his dad, holding a wrench and asking curiously how to fix an engine. The day of the handover, I stood next to him, watching him silently observe the oil-stained floor. The buyer, a businessman from Los Angeles, again offered a ridiculous price, but Chris didn't argue. He just nodded, signed the papers, and left without looking back. When the money started to run out, I noticed the finger where Chris wore his wedding ring was empty. The simple silver band he and Irene had exchanged on their wedding day was gone. I asked him with a trembling voice, "Chris, where is your ring?" He didn't look at me, he just mumbled, "I sold it, Mum. The pawn shop paid well." I felt as if my heart was being squeezed. That ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was the promise he had made to Irene, the symbol of their love. I wanted to run to the pawn shop to get it back, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. Chris had already made his decision, and I could only watch in silence, my soul in pieces. Every time Chris brought money home, Irene cried. She would take his rough hand, look at the empty finger and sob. "Forgive me, Chris. I don't want you to suffer like this for me." Her tears moved me. One afternoon, while Chris was out looking for more money, I went into my room, opened the wardrobe, and took out an old tin box. Inside was all my life savings, every dollar saved for my old age, for the days when I could no longer bake. I carried the box to Chris and placed it in his hands. "Take it, son," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Saving your wife is the most important thing." He looked at me with red eyes, unable to speak. "Thank you, Mum," he whispered, and turned away, as if afraid I would notice his fragility. One morning, Irene suddenly announced that she had to go to the New York hospital for a special radiation treatment that would last all day. She looked weak, with pale skin and tired eyes. She hugged Leo and Sophia tightly and told them, "Listen to Grandma and your dad. Mummy will be back soon." Her voice was soft but firm, as if she didn't want anyone to argue. Chris wanted to go with her, but she refused. "Don't worry, I can go alone. You've worked enough." She wore a thick coat, even though it was a sunny, warm day, saying her body was now very sensitive to temperature. I watched her leave through the door, with her purse on her shoulder and a slow step, and I felt a strange unease in my chest. That night, Irene returned exhausted. She collapsed into Chris's arms, said she was very tired, and went to sleep early. I watched him hug her, his eyes full of tenderness, and my heart ached. As I gathered the family's dirty clothes to wash them, my hands touched Irene's coat. It was a little damp, as if it had been splashed with water. Out of habit, I checked the pockets before putting it in the washing machine. My fingers hit a hard piece of paper. I took it out, thinking it was a prescription or a medical appointment. But no, it was a receipt from the Arch Manor restaurant, one of the most elegant places in the city, where people like us rarely dare to go. My eyes fixed on the details. 2 steaks, a bottle of red wine, chocolate dessert. The total was enough to buy groceries for a whole week. But what made my heart tremble was the date and time. That same midday, exactly when Irene said she was at the radiation therapy session, I stood motionless, the receipt trembling in my fingers. No, it couldn't be. Irene was sick. She couldn't have gone to an expensive restaurant to eat like that. There must have been some mistake. Maybe she sat next to someone at the hospital and that person accidentally put the receipt in her pocket. I repeated that to myself over and over, trying to drive away the suspicion that was beginning to grow inside me. I was about to go into Chris and Irene's room to ask her the truth, but when I reached the door, I heard her calm breathing and stopped. I imagined Irene waking up, her face pale and her eyes full of fear, and I knew I would hurt her if I confronted her just because of a piece of paper. I convinced myself. Don't think nonsense. She's very sick. Don't worry her more. I folded the receipt and put it back in the coat pocket, but the numbers kept spinning in my head. About 2 months after those tense days due to Irene's illness, I began to believe that light was returning to our family. One afternoon, I was preparing a simple dinner at Chris's house, trying to make pot roast, the dish everyone adored, to cheer up the atmosphere. Leo and Sophia were scribbling on sheets of paper, while Chris, having just arrived from the garage, still smelled of oil and metal. Irene entered the dining room with a radiant expression, very different from her weak appearance before. She held a piece of paper, her hands slightly trembling, but her eyes shining as if she had found a treasure. "Mom, Chris, kids, listen," she said in a clear, almost joyful voice. "The doctor said the cancer cells are completely gone. I'm cured." I froze. The spoon fell from my hand and hit the table with a dry sound. Chris dropped the plate, and the sound of the porcelain breaking echoed on the floor. He snatched the paper from Irene's hands, his eyes fixed on the printed lines, reading them over and over as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Really, Irene? Really?" His voice cracked, and suddenly he hugged his wife, crying with joy. He lifted her in his arms and spun her around the room, laughing like a child who has just received the gift he wanted most. Leo and Sophia, although they didn't fully understand what was happening, ran to hug their parents' legs, laughing too. Seeing that scene, I felt a weight on my chest dissolve. Tears flowed, not from sadness, but from relief. I had blamed myself for doubting Irene, for letting that restaurant receipt torment me. She had fought. She had overcome the illness, and now our family could start over. I hugged her and whispered, "You scared me to death, but thank God you're okay." She smiled, hugged me back, and replied in a trembling voice, "Thank you, Mum, for always being with me." Her words filled my heart, as if all past worries had vanished like a distant nightmare. We all sat around the table, and for the first time in months, the atmosphere was filled with laughter. Chris told old anecdotes, like the time he ruined a customer's car because he couldn't stop looking at Irene when she walked past the garage. Leo and Sophia competed to tell their school stories and show their drawings. I looked at them and silently prayed that from that moment on, everything would be better. The crisis had passed, and I decided to go back to my house to give Chris's family back their space. The day I picked up my suitcase to leave, Irene took my hand, her eyes filled with tears. "Mum, I will never forget everything you did for us. You are the best mother in the world." I smiled and patted her hand. "As long as you're healthy and your family is happy, I'm happy." As I walked out the door, I looked back. A warm, golden light escaped from the window. I thought maybe that was the new beginning we all needed, but only a few weeks later, I began to notice strange signs. Our Saturday family dinner, a tradition we had always respected, was cancelled for the first time. Irene called me in a soft but rushed voice. "Mum, Leo has a slight fever today. We won't be able to come. Forgive me, okay?" I was worried and offered to go see the boy, but she avoided it. "Don't worry, Mum. It's just a cold. We'll go next week." I nodded, although I felt a pang of sadness. The following week she called again, this time saying they were both exhausted after a hard week of work. "Mum, we need to rest a bit. We'll go next week, I promise you." Her voice was still sweet, but something had changed. It sounded distant, as if she was building an invisible wall between us. Little by little, I realized that Irene no longer brought Leo and Sophia to visit me so often. She used to come with them to the bakery. The children played with the flour, laughed when I pretended to be a monster with a face full of white powder. But now those visits became rare, and then almost completely disappeared. When I called her, she always had an excuse. "Mum, we are very busy this week," or "Sophia has drawing classes, we can't arrange it." I tried to convince myself that she was just busy, that she needed time to recover after so many months of illness. But every time I hung up the phone, a feeling of emptiness pressed on my chest. Then Chris began to call me, his voice full of worry. One night, while I was knitting a sweater for Sophia, the phone rang. "Mom." His voice sounded deep and heavy. "Lately, Irene is very strange. She buys a lot of new clothes. She wears a lot of makeup every time she goes out. Some nights she goes somewhere and comes back very late. She says she met up with old friends." My heart began to pound. Old friends? Irene almost never talked about friendships, and since she got sick, I never saw her go anywhere but the hospital. I tried to keep calm. "Maybe she just wants to relax a little, honey. She just got over an illness. Maybe she wants to make up for the difficult days." But even I couldn't believe those words. Again, Chris called almost at midnight, his voice on the verge of desperation. "Mom, last night Irene didn't come home. She said she stayed at a friend's house because she got drunk. I don't believe her, Mum, but I don't know what to do." I felt like I was going crazy. Irene, the same woman who was so weak before that she could barely stand, now had the strength to go out partying all night. "Calm down, son," I told him, although I myself was tied up in knots inside. "Give her time. Maybe she's just trying to find herself again." But deep down I knew I was lying to myself. The pieces were starting to fit. The restaurant receipt, the miraculous recovery, the sudden change in her attitude. They were all fragments of a puzzle that didn't fit, and I was afraid to complete it, because I sensed that the final image would be too painful. Sometimes I deliberately drove past the street where Chris lived, just to see if the bedroom light was on. There were nights when the whole house was dark, even though it was barely 8 o'clock. I stayed there, under the yellowish light of the street lamp, my heart heavy. My mother's instinct told me a new storm was brewing. I remembered Irene's smile when she announced she was cured. I remembered the sparkle in her eyes, and I wondered if that joy was real or just a mask. I asked Chris to be patient, to give his wife time. Until that fateful night, when the phone rang and his broken voice came from the other end of the line. Mum, Irene, she wants a divorce. And now I am here, stopped at the doorway, my hand gripping the doorknob, feeling a mix of fear and rage. The man named Philip is in front of me, thin, his old shoes soaked, not daring to look me in the eye. Under the yellowish light of the hallway, his face looks tired, full of wrinkles that seem to tell a life of suffering. I ask, in a cold but trembling voice, "What do you know about my daughter-in-law?" Philip hesitates, his lips moving as if searching for words. "I know about her illness," he says in a hoarse voice, as if each word cost him a great effort. The two words, her illness, pierce my chest like a knife. Illness? The same one that cost us so much effort, money, and hope. I look inside and see Chris sitting up on the couch, his eyes wide, looking toward the door. His haggard face, his eyes red from sleepless nights and pain. I take a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and with a nod of my head, I signal Philip to come in. "Come in," I say with a firmness I didn't know I had. The yellow light of the kitchen illuminates every wrinkle on his tired face, and that sight only increases my unease. Chris jumped up, his voice hoarse. "Mom, who is it?" He looked at Philip. Then he looked at me, as if seeking an explanation. Before I could say a word, Philip lowered his head and murmured, "I'm Philip Harris. I'm an accountant at the Medicare clinic, where Irene worked as a nurse." His voice trembled, as if a gust of wind could make him collapse. I pulled out a chair, signaling for him to sit down, but he just stood there, his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the small cracks in the old wooden table. Philip began to speak, his voice monotonous but full of pain. He didn't dare look at Chris directly, only stared at the table, as if those cracks could hide his shame. He spoke of his wife, that she had a congenital heart condition since she was a child. "She needed a very expensive operation," he said, his voice choked. "I ran everywhere, I borrowed, I sold land, but it wasn't enough. I didn't know what to do to save her." I felt my heart clench. I know that helplessness, seeing someone you love fading away and not being able to do anything. But then Philip's story chilled my blood. "Irene came looking for me," he continued, his voice even more shaky. "She knew about my situation. She knew I was desperate. She told me, 'I know how to get a lot of money fast, but I need your help.'" I felt my blood turn to ice. Irene, my daughter-in-law, whom I had seen as an angel. Philip recounted that Irene devised a cruel plan. She would pretend to have cancer, and he, with his job as an accountant and his access to the clinic's system, would fabricate a perfect false medical file, blood test results, diagnostic images, stamps, the signature of a non-existent doctor. He did it all at Irene's request. "She promised me she would pay me $500,000, he said with red eyes. That amount was enough to save his wife. I sat there, my hands gripping the edge of the chair, trying not to tremble. Chris remained motionless, his gaze frozen, not blinking. Philip continued, his voice increasingly broken. "I accepted. I knew it was wrong, but I had no other option. I did everything she asked, from invoices for special, non-existent medications to false medical reports. I thought that if I saved my wife, I would deal with the consequences. But when the plan came together, when Irene received all of Chris's money, the money from the truck, the auto shop, and even the wedding ring, she disappeared. She blocked Philip's number, quit her job at the clinic, cut all contact. I went to her house," he said, looking up at Chris for the first time, with a gaze full of guilt. "She laughed and told me I had no proof. Then she kicked me out." The air in the kitchen became dense, as if all the oxygen had run out. Philip dropped his head onto the table, his shoulders shaking convulsively. 2 weeks later, my wife died, he whispered, his voice shattered. She died in the hospital bed, while I was still waiting for money that never came. I had to lean on the back of the chair to stay standing. My head was spinning. I looked at Chris, and my heart broke at the sight of his face. He didn't scream. He didn't get angry. His face was empty, lifeless, as if his soul had left him. Slowly he raised his hand and touched the finger where he used to wear his wedding ring, his gaze lost. Philip sat up and placed a thin, wrinkled stack of papers on the table. "These are the drafts of the files I made," he said in a rough voice. "They have no legal value, but it's all I have. I came to confess and to help you get justice." I looked at the stack, the clumsy letters and the fake seals, and a rage I had never known before flooded over me. But more than rage, it was pain. Pain for my son, for what he sacrificed, for that blind love that led him to the abyss. Chris clenched his fist so hard his knuckles turned white. He turned to me, his gaze empty. "Mom," he said, his voice broken. "It turns out I sold everything I had for a scam." I felt as if my heart was tearing in two, but looking at Chris, seeing that desperation in his eyes, I knew I had to be strong. I put my hand on his shoulder and squeezed it, as if trying to pass some strength to him. "Son," I said, my voice trembling, "we are going to uncover the truth. I promise you." That night, my small kitchen was immersed in a dense silence, broken only by the sound of the rain falling slower and slower outside the window. Philip, Chris, and I were sitting around the old wooden table, each lost in thought, but all trapped by the painful truth Philip had just revealed. I looked at my son, motionless in the chair, his eyes empty, occasionally letting out a lifeless laugh, as if he still couldn't believe what he had just heard. Philip, his face grey, continued to recount more details of Irene's plan. He spoke of her intelligence and her cruelty, of how she had calculated every step to deceive Chris, from the fake calls to the hospital, to her tears and her role as a terminally ill patient. Every word of his was like a stab in the chest, but I forced myself to remain firm, to listen clearly. "Irene knew how to make everyone believe her," Philip said, his voice trembling. "She once told me that with a few tears and a diagnosis paper, she could make anyone do what she wanted." I felt the blood boil in my veins. Irene, the girl I had treated like a daughter, the one who took my hand and thanked me for being by her side, was actually the one who had woven this whole web of lies. But looking at Chris, his head down and his face in his hands, I not only felt rage but also pain. Pain because my son had sacrificed everything: his car, his auto shop, his wedding ring, and his heart, only to fall into a trap. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, staining the kitchen floor gold, Philip stood up. His slumped shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the world. "I'll go to the police station," he said, his voice firm but full of repentance. "I'm going to confess everything. I can't keep living with this guilt." I looked at him, not knowing whether to feel compassion or anger. He was part of the deception, but he had also lost the woman he loved, just as Chris had lost his family. I nodded silently and got up to prepare coffee for the three of us, hoping a little warmth would restore our strength. The next morning, the police station was cold and deserted. The air smelled of old paper, ink, and dust. We waited almost an hour in a long corridor, sitting on hard plastic chairs, until a young, still sleepy police officer agreed to see us. Philip began to speak, his voice calm but tense, as if walking on a tightrope. He pulled out a stack of papers, copies of the fake files he had created for Irene. I watched the officer, expecting to see some reaction, but he just glanced at the papers dismissively before handing them back with a yawn. "Is that all?" he asked with a bored tone. "Your statement is just one version. Ms. Irene Torres has legal medical documents, and you have nothing more than these sheets. We cannot open an investigation based on an unsubstantiated story." I felt the blood rush to my head. Chris, sitting next to me, tried to explain, his voice hoarse. "Don't you understand? I sold the car, the auto shop, even my wedding ring to pay for her illness treatment. And now she's taking everything, even my children." But the officer just shrugged and interrupted him. "Sounds like a property dispute after a divorce. Family matter. Get a lawyer." He gestured with his hand, indicating for us to leave, and returned to concentrating on the pile of papers on his desk. We left the police station. The morning sun was shining brightly, but my heart was submerged in darkness. Chris slumped onto the steps, holding his head in his hands, and his voice broke. "It's over, Mum. Not even the law will help us." Philip stood to one side, his face pale and his hands clasped, as if he wanted to hide his guilt. I looked at the two men in front of me. One, my son, who had lost everything for love. The other, his accomplice, now tormented by conscience. The rage and pain inside me had turned into something harder, like a silent, impossible to extinguish fire. I took Chris by the shoulders and forced him to stand up. "No, son," I said, looking him in the eyes with a firm voice. "If the law won't see, we'll make it see." He looked at me, and in his tired eyes, I saw a tiny spark of hope shine. Philip looked up and nodded, as if my words had also awakened some resolve in him. I knew we couldn't stop, that we couldn't let Irene get away with it. When we got home, I went straight to the old phone on the shelf. My hands were shaking as I opened the yellowed notebook, looking for a name I hadn't spoken in more than 10 years, Larry Benson. He had been a colleague of my husband in the police force, a private investigator known for his cunning and for never giving up. I took a deep breath and dialed the number. On the other end, a deep, raspy voice answered. "Hello? Who is this?" I introduced myself, my voice a little shaky. "Larry, it's Mary Johnson, Robert Johnson's wife. I need your help." I told Larry everything, from the restaurant receipt I found in Irene's coat, to the days Chris sold everything to save her, and finally Philip's confession. I didn't omit any detail, although every word hurt like salt in an open wound. Larry listened in silence, murmuring occasionally to let me know he was still there. When I finished, he only asked one question. "What is your daughter-in-law's full name?" "Irene Torres," I replied with a trembling voice. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, as if he was searching his memory. Then he said thoughtfully, "I've heard that name before. There's something shady in her past. Stay calm. I will help you." I hung up the phone and looked at Chris and Philip, feeling a ray of hope light up inside me. The next morning, when the first rays of sun filtered through the curtains, I heard soft but firm knocks on the door. I opened it, and there was Larry Benson. He didn't look like the elegant detective I had imagined. He wore an old, worn-out shirt. His hair was grey and messy, his eyes tired but so sharp they seemed to see through secrets. He didn't say much, just nodded and came in, with an aged leather briefcase in his hand. I invited him to sit down and quickly made a cup of coffee, although anxiety was consuming me inside. "What have you discovered?" I asked him with a trembling voice, unable to hide my impatience. Larry placed the briefcase on the table, opened it, and took out the copy of the diagnosis Irene had given us. He took a small magnifying glass and carefully examined the red seal and the shaky signature of Dr. Edward Sanders. He murmured in a grave voice, "This seal is too perfect. It has no ink smudges. It looks printed, not hand-stamped." I was next to him, my heart pounding. Just one sentence, but it was enough to awaken all the doubts I had tried to bury. Chris, who had just come out of the bedroom, heard what he said and sat down in the chair, his gaze tense. "What do you mean by that?" he asked in a hoarse voice. Larry didn't answer immediately. He just shook his head and carefully folded the paper. "Give me a few days," he said before leaving Chris and me in a suffocating atmosphere, full of unanswered questions. 2 days later, while I was cleaning the bakery, the phone rang. Larry's voice, monotonous on the other end of the line, said, "St. Raphael General Hospital in New York. The address listed in the documents is actually an empty lot awaiting development. It has never existed." A chill ran down my spine, and I tightly gripped the receiver. Chris, next to me, slumped into the chair, his face pale. Larry continued, "And the doctor, Edward Sanders, who signs the document, does not appear in the registry of any medical association in the country. He's a ghost." I put the call on speaker so Chris could also hear, but he just sat there, his gaze lost. Larry added that he remembered the name Irene Torres from a medical insurance fraud case a few years ago. It was a minor matter, went unnoticed, and was archived when the victim suddenly withdrew the complaint. "I contacted that person," Larry said, his voice calm but sharp. "They told me Irene introduced herself as a nurse and promised them a miracle treatment for diabetes from a secret doctor. They gave her money, but they never heard about that treatment again." I felt the blood run cold. Irene, the daughter-in-law I loved and cared for so much, had such a dark past. With that information, Larry began to investigate the supposed Dr. Edward more thoroughly. He discovered that he used to frequent a rented house on the outskirts of New York. "I went there," he said over the phone. "I didn't go in. I only observed from the car and took pictures." He described a 2-story house, ordinary, but with the windows covered by thick curtains. Sometimes, luxury cars would arrive, bringing people, and they would leave right away. As I listened to him, I imagined a mysterious place, like a den of dark secrets. Then, Larry recounted that one afternoon, he saw a man taking out the trash in the yard. He waited for him to leave and secretly checked the bag. Inside, he found empty boxes of cheap, unlabeled supplements, and most importantly, a discarded flash drive. That night, Larry came to my house. He didn't say anything. He just turned on his old laptop and plugged in the flash drive. "Ms. Johnson, Mr. Chris, prepare yourselves," he said in a serious, grave voice. I sat next to Chris, taking his hand, feeling his palm cold as ice. Several videos appeared on the screen. The room in the video was arranged like an elegant private clinic, clean bed, heart rate monitor, and some medical equipment that looked very professional. Then Irene appeared. She wore a white coat, her hair pulled back, a radiant smile. She joked with a man we assumed was Edward. They laughed loudly, as if sharing a funny story, without the slightest worry. A different video began, and this time I felt my heart stop. Irene was lying in a hospital bed, her face made up to look pale, her eyes closed, like a patient on the verge of death. Edward was next to her, carefully connecting a bag of IV fluid to her arm. But when the camera moved, I clearly saw that the bag only contained saline water. Irene cracked her eyes open, winked mischievously at the cameraman, and then returned to her role as the weak patient. I felt the blood rush to my head. My throat closed as if it were being squeezed. Chris jumped up and knocked over the small side table. The sound of the breaking glasses echoed on the floor. He pounded the wall hard and roared with pain and rage. She tricked me. She tricked my mother. My children. I stayed seated, unable to move, my gaze fixed on the blank screen. Larry closed the computer in silence, but the room remained immersed in a heavy silence, broken only by Chris's agitated breathing. Larry looked directly at me with a grave, firm voice. "Ms. Johnson, your daughter-in-law is not a victim. She is the one behind the whole crime." The next morning, Larry arrived early, with his usual simple appearance, but with a determined look. He carried his old laptop and the stack of papers Philip had given him. "Come on, Ms. Johnson," he said in a low but firm voice. "Today we will get the police to listen." I nodded and woke up Chris. He sat up with red eyes, but nodded with determination. We got in the car, heading to the police station, without saying a word, silently watching the road, as if preparing for a battle. At the police station, Larry didn't let us stop at the reception like the previous time. He took out his retired police ID and asked to speak directly with the head of criminal investigations. The young employee looked at him with distrust, but after a brief call, we were led to a small meeting room with dull white walls, a long wooden table, and hard chairs. The chief, Mr. Michael Sanders, entered with his serious expression and cold gaze. He sat down, crossed his arms, and observed us with skepticism. "I've been told you have evidence of a scam, but I warn you, if this is just a family conflict, we don't have time." I felt the blood boil. I wanted to respond, but Larry raised his hand to signal me to stay calm. He placed the laptop on the table and played the video we had seen the night before. The room fell silent. Only the buzzing of the ceiling fan and Irene's laughter from the screen, cutting like a knife. When the video ended, with Irene winking in her role as the fake patient, Mr. Sanders' face changed completely. The distrust disappeared, replaced by a cold, sharp concentration. He picked up the phone. He called 2 more investigators. "Document everything," he ordered in a firm voice. We began to recount the entire story. I told them about the restaurant receipt, about the days Irene claimed to go to radiation therapy and returned with a surprisingly radiant appearance. Chris, in a hoarse voice, spoke of how he sold the car, the auto shop, and even the wedding ring and the large sums of money he had given Irene without hesitation. Philip, his gaze full of guilt, confessed his participation in the fraud. How he falsified the medical reports and the times he met with Irene to plan it. When the investigator informed him that he would be detained to cooperate with the investigation, Philip just nodded in a calm voice. "I'm not going to run. I lost my wife. I'm not going to lose my conscience too." Before being taken away, he looked at me with regret. "Ms. Johnson, I'm sorry for putting you and Chris through this." I nodded without saying anything, but in my heart, I no longer held a grudge against him. He was also a victim, just like us. Chris presented all the documents, the sales contract for the car, the auto shop, and the bank statements that showed the large sums of money transferred to Irene's account. When the investigator asked him what kind of compensation he wanted to request, Chris shook his head, his voice firm but full of pain. "I don't want any property. I just want my children to be safe. Leo and Sophia don't deserve to go through this." Hearing him, I felt as if something was squeezing my chest. I took his hand under the table, gripping it tightly, as if wanting to tell him I wouldn't leave him alone. With the video evidence, Philip's testimony, and Chris's documents, Mr. Sanders did not hesitate. He signed the urgent search warrant for the house Larry called the Ghost Hospital, along with arrest warrants for Irene Torres, Edward Sanders, and the accomplices who appeared in the video. I watched him write every word, and a mix of relief and tension had ran through my body. Finally, justice was beginning to move. The investigators immediately sprang into action. Radios crackled in the hallways with short, precise orders. A special team was assembled, and I saw them checking their weapons, adjusting their bulletproof vests, and preparing to leave. The atmosphere in the police station became tense, as before a great battle. We finished the procedures and left the police station as night was falling. I felt exhausted, but at the same time, a strange sense of relief was making its way inside me. For the first time in many months, I felt we were no longer alone. At that moment, several police cruisers turned on their sirens in unison. The blue and red lights flashed as the cars shot out of the gate and were lost in traffic. I stood on the steps, holding Chris's hand, watching the convoy until it disappeared. The sound of the sirens faded away, but for me, it was the sound of justice, a sound for which we had paid too high a price to hear. That night, Chris and I couldn't sleep. We stayed in the small kitchen under the yellowish light that illuminated the old walls, as if reminding us of all the pain we had endured. Chris tightly held the photo of Leo and Sophia. His gaze was lost, as if searching for a ray of light in the middle of the darkness. I prepared ginger tea, but neither of us touched it. We just stayed there, in silence, waiting for any news from Larry. Near midnight, the phone rang, breaking the oppressive stillness. Larry's voice was brief, but firm. "We caught them all." They were celebrating a new score. He recounted that the team had raided the ghost hospital at dawn. Irene, Edward, and 4 other accomplices, including a man Larry suspected was Irene's new lover, were captured in the middle of a luxurious party with expensive wine and food, luxuries Chris would never have allowed himself, even by selling his entire life to save her. "They didn't have time to react," Larry said coldly. The police found fake documents, computers with data from other scams, and a safe full of cash. But what made me tremble was the news about the children. "Leo and Sophia were there," Larry continued. "They were taken to a social services center while their guardians are confirmed." Chris jumped up, his eyes red and his voice trembling. "My children, I have to go to them right now." I took his hand, trying to calm him down, although I was also tied up in knots inside. We ran to the car and drove toward the social services center in the middle of the night. The hours we spent waiting there seemed eternal. Chris was beside himself, pacing back and forth in the cold hallway, mumbling, "Mother, if anything happens to them, I couldn't live." I hugged him and whispered, "They'll be fine, son. We'll bring them back." But deep down, I was afraid. Afraid that the days trapped in Irene's lies had left scars on the innocent souls of those 2 little ones. After almost 2 days working with the lawyer and the authorities, we were finally allowed to pick up Leo and Sophia. Entering the small room of the shelter, I saw Chris kneel and open his arms. Leo and Sophia, with confused faces, stayed still for a moment, as if they didn't believe it was their father. Then they ran toward him, crying uncontrollably. "Daddy!" Sophia clung to his neck, while Leo held his hand, his eyes red. "Where's Mummy, Daddy? Why didn't she come get us?" Sophia asked, in a voice so innocent that I felt my heart break. Chris just hugged them tighter, not answering, but I saw his shoulders tremble. I knelt down, hugged the 3 of them, and held back my tears. "From now on, Grandma will always be here with you, okay?" The 2 nodded, although their gazes were still full of confusion. The investigation lasted several months, and each day was another test. The police discovered that Irene and Edward's scam network had been operating for years, tricking hundreds of victims and stealing millions of dollars. Irene was not only an accomplice, but the one in charge of finding and approaching the prey, using her sweet appearance and her role as a nurse to gain their trust. Every new detail that came to light was like another stab in the heart. I had loved her, treated her like a daughter, stayed up all night cooking soup for her. And it had all been a perfectly planned play. The day of the trial, Chris and I arrived early. The courthouse was in downtown Los Angeles, an old building with long hallways and the smell of damp wood. I took Chris's hand and felt his skin was cold. We sat in the first row, in front of the judge's bench. When Irene entered, I barely recognized her. She wore the grey prisoner uniform. Her long, shiny hair was now cropped short, her face pale, not from illness, but from the evident fear in her eyes. When her eyes met ours, she immediately looked away, unable to hold them. I looked at her, my soul empty, without rage, without relief, just with a sense of loss, impossible to describe. The prosecutor presented the evidence. The video from the flash drive, Philip's testimony, other testimonies from victims deceived by Irene, and the financial records that showed how the money from Chris's account had ended up in the hands of Irene and Edward. Philip was called as a witness. He stood in front of the court, his body thin, but his voice firm and clear. He told everything. How Irene approached him, promising him money to save his wife, and how he falsified documents. He didn't make excuses. He just bowed his head. I know I was wrong. I just wanted to save my wife, but I ended up making many people suffer. Seeing him, I no longer felt anger, only compassion. He had paid with the greatest loss of his life. Chris was also called to the stand. He stood up straight, without looking at Irene even once. His voice was so serene it was chilling as he recounted the days he sold everything, the car, the auto shop, the wedding ring, to save the woman he loved. He spoke of the sleepless nights, the pain of losing his children, the desperation upon discovering that everything had been a lie. I don't want anything. I just want my children to be safe, he said, his voice cracking. I, sitting below, let the tears fall silently. My son, the one who once smiled like the sun, was now there, like the shadow of the man he was. Finally, the judge delivered the sentence. Edward, the ringleader, received 20 years in prison for fraud and organized crime. Irene, as an active accomplice, was sentenced to 12 years. The other people involved received between 5 and 8 years. Philip, for his cooperation and sincere confession, only received 2 years, a considerably reduced sentence. Upon hearing the verdict, Irene collapsed, screamed, cursed, and resisted as the guards removed her from the courtroom. "You don't understand. I didn't have a choice," she shouted. But no one in the room was moved. I watched her leave, with the handcuffs tightened on her wrists, and when her gaze met mine, I didn't look away. I stared at her, but I no longer saw anything more than a freezing emptiness. That woman was no longer the Irene I had known. We left the courthouse, and the bright sun made me squint. Chris hugged Leo and Sophia, and the 2 children clung tightly to their father. Sophia looked up with an innocent voice. "Daddy, why is Mommy taking so long to come back?" Chris bent down, kissed their foreheads, and replied in a hoarse but firm voice. "From today on, Daddy will be both Daddy and Mommy to you." I looked at my son and my grandchildren, feeling a mixture of pain and strength. We had lost many things, but we still had each other, and that was the most important thing. 1 year after the trial, time had passed, but the wounds were still there, throbbing like scars that never quite close. I was in my small kitchen, kneading flour, feeling the softness of the dough between my hands. The bakery, which I had to close during the days of crisis, was now open again. I gave it a new name, Sunrise, as a reminder that, after the dark nights, the light always returns. Curiously, customers came in greater numbers than before. They came not only for the warm bread or the crispy cookies, but also for our family's story, published in all the newspapers. Strangers sent letters, called on the phone, or even came to the shop just to offer words of encouragement. "Miss Johnson, you are very brave," an old lady told me while buying bread, her eyes shining. I just smiled, but inside I knew I wasn't strong on my own. I had Chris, Leo, Sophia, and everyone who had stood by us. Chris did not try to reclaim the old auto shop, although I knew he still remembered the days he worked alongside his father. Instead, he rented a small garage right next to my bakery, just big enough for a few cars. He opened his own shop, but only accepted to repair old cars, those of hard-working people who couldn't afford the big garages. "Mum, I want to do something that makes sense," he told me once, his hands still stained with grease. His garage was small, but it was always full of laughter, the sound of hammers, and grateful customers getting their cars running again. Seeing him work, I noticed the light in his eyes again, not as intense as before, but enough to know that he was finding his way. Leo and Sophia had returned to school, slowly adapting among classmates, drawings, and writing assignments. They were getting used to living without their mother, although I knew that questions about Irene still appeared in their minds sometimes. One afternoon, while I was braiding Sophia's hair, she looked up and asked, "Grandma, is Mummy coming back?" I stopped my hands, looked into her clear eyes, and felt a knot in my chest. I didn't want to lie to her, but I also didn't want to break her little heart. "Your mummy is in a very distant place, trying to correct her mistakes," I replied softly. "But you have your daddy, your grandma, and Leo. We are a family, right?" Sophia nodded and hugged me, and I felt the warmth of her small arms surrounding me. Chris, when the children asked about their mother, always answered them patiently, in a firm voice full of sadness. "Mommy made a mistake, but Daddy will always be here for you." One early morning, as I was kneading the first batch of bread, I saw a thin figure peering through the bakery door. I looked up and recognized Philip. He had been released from prison early for good behavior, but he still looked haggard, with sunken eyes, carrying a lifetime of remorse. He stood there, twisting his old hat in his hands, not daring to enter. "Miss Johnson," he said in a low voice, I would like to ask for a job. I can deliver bread, clean, do whatever is necessary." I looked at him, with mixed feelings between the memories of what he did and the sincerity I now saw in his eyes. Before I could answer, Chris crossed over from the garage, his hands still stained with grease. He looked at Philip, then at me, and although he hesitated for an instant, he finally nodded without saying a word and returned to his shop. I understood his gesture. "That's fine, Mr. Harris," I told him. "Starting tomorrow, you can take care of delivering the bread for the shop." From that day on, Philip became the bread delivery man for Sunrise. He worked diligently, in silence, always punctual and never complaining. Sometimes, when the oven broke down or a customer's car had problems, he would join Chris to fix it. I, from the kitchen, watched them through the window. Two men, one who lost his wife to betrayal, the other who lost her due to his own cowardice, cleaning an old spark plug together. They didn't talk much, only exchanged a few words about work, but there was a strange understanding between them. Both had suffered losses, both had been dragged through the storm called Irene, and now they were learning to love again. Not romantic love, but love for what they do, for life, and for responsibility. The light of sunset streamed through the bakery window, staining the flour particles suspended in the air with gold. The oven was still on. The aroma of freshly baked bread filled the room. Leo and Sophia had just returned from school. Sitting at the corner table, they coloured drawings of houses and trees. Leo looked up and showed me his drawing. A small house with 3 people, him, Sophia, and Chris, under the sun. "Grandma, this is our house," he said proudly. I smiled, stroking his head, and felt an indescribable warmth in my chest. Sophia interrupted. "I want to draw Grandma too." And the two laughed, fighting over the red pencil. I stood there, looking at my family, looking at the small bakery that was now overflowing with laughter and voices. There are wounds that never completely heal, scars that remind us of the storms we have survived. But I understood that no matter how deep the pain, we can always move forward, as long as there are people willing to give us warmth. After everything we've been through, I understood that life can be cruel, but it also gives us the opportunity to get up, start over, and find the light among the shadows. I once believed that kindness could change everything, but the truth is that blind kindness this only makes us pray. Still, I don't regret having loved, because it was that love, even betrayed, that kept me standing. I want to tell you something. Never allow your trust to be used against you, but don't let resentment dry up your heart either. Justice can take time, but it always arrives. And when we manage to overcome loss, what remains is not hatred, but the strength to continue living, to forgive, and to teach those we love to recognize true goodness. The story you have just heard has changed names and places to protect the identity of those involved. We tell it not to judge, but with the hope that someone listens and pauses to reflect. How many mothers might be suffering in silence within their own home? I really wonder. If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Would you remain silent to maintain peace, or would you dare to face everything to reclaim your voice? I want to know your opinion, because every story can become a candle that illuminates someone else's path. God always blesses, and I am sure that courage will lead us to better days. Now, on the final screen, I will leave 2 of the channel's most beloved stories. I'm sure they will surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until this moment.